Nintendo DS. Chat wirelessly, play wirelessly.
Hello.
Hi. Welcome.
This is a very different but same episode of the Game Punks.
Exactly. This is a brand new inaugural episode for a new series that we'll be working on going forward. This is called Game Punks Touch Generation, or just Touch Generation, and it is a podcast dedicated to exploring the games library of the Nintendo DS family of consoles. So that includes the DS, the DSi, and the 3DS. And
Often too overlooked.
Yeah,
honestly,
it's a library that's full of ambitious games, weird games, experimental games.
Not always good, but very memorable.
Exactly. Some games that were very impressive for their time, and some that were less so, but still left kind of an impression. So I guess I think that it's of value to discuss the library of this console, because this console ended up kind of becoming Nintendo's saving grace for a very long time. I guess, like, starting with the DS, but moving into its kind of later iterations, like the DSi and the 3DS. It became like the backbone of Nintendo's market for a very long time. Yeah.
Honestly, if the 3DS or new 3DS XL, whatever, didn't exist when the Wii U came out, I feel like Nintendo would have died.
Yeah, Nintendo would have taken a pretty hard hit there. Like, if they...
I mean, they did take a pretty hard hit there.
They were not coming out swinging with that Wii U. Like, it really did not do them any good.
No.
And the interesting thing about the Nintendo DS is that story kind of begins also in a rough patch of Nintendo's history. So it's kind of a console that was born out of and existed through a period of immense turmoil for Nintendo as a company. A very turbulent and different time. But it begins in the early 2000s. So the early 2000s were a really, really rough time for Nintendo. Like, bad. The company was in like a period of heavy transition because Hiroshi Yamauchi, who had been president of Nintendo for like 53 years, stepped down from that position in 2002 and ceded it to Satoru Iwata, who was the first person unrelated to the Yamauchi family to ever hold the title of president for Nintendo. So that he was literally leaving his family's company to a complete newcomer, a complete outsider, at least according to, I think, a lot of the board members at the time. It was a very controversial decision. And subsequently, the earnings for Nintendo were kind of at an all-time low, because in 2003 they posted their first ever profit losses for the beginning of that fiscal year. It was their first ever profit loss. Ever. Their first ever loss. And that...
And this is from a company that's been running for, like, at that point,
since the 1800s.
Yeah, since the 1800s, because they started out as a card game company.
Exactly. And, like, the console that they had released at the time, which was the GameCube, it was their most recent piece of console hardware, it's remembered very fondly nowadays because, I mean, it had a great controller, it's got a library of cult classic games, but it was faring very poorly compared to its direct competition, like Sony's PlayStation 2, Microsoft's Xbox. Both of those consoles were marketed as, like, multimedia things with DVD players and just a host of, unique features that the GameCube didn't have, because the GameCube was, as its name suggests, purely focused on presenting its, like, kind of like player base with a gaming experience and nothing more. So its perception in the eyes of the public as kind of the family-friendly option in the 6th generation lineup damned it to 3rd place. Like, it was not doing good, and it failed to recapture the share of the home console market that Nintendo had kind of slowly been losing out on since the mid-90s, because the 64 was also kind of like the second tier to the PS1.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Which is unfortunate given like both of those consoles, like both the 64 and GameCube respectively, their game library is still to this day one of the most easy to go back to and like funnest to go back to.
yeah,
'Cause
it's really, really accessible.
Of course, that's saying like that's not to go without saying that like PS2 and Xbox don't have some very, very good games that hold up. But I mean, percentage-wise, I think more 64 games and GameCube games hold up way better than a lot of PS2 and Xbox One games.
I would agree.
do.
I think it's because Nintendo was very careful choosing who their third-party collaborators were at the time, and Sony, as kind of an untested new games market, weren't so choosy, and so there's like a lot more shovelware on the PS1. And it's like something that, ironically enough, Nintendo would actually end up encountering later on with stuff like the DS and the Wii, with like not being super choosy with their developers and stuff. But they burned a lot of bridges when they decided to stick with cartridges for the N64.
Yeah.
Like it really hurt their perception in the eyes of their other developers and stuff, and third-party developers, because third-party developers wanted to develop for a console that used CD media. So needless to say, they weren't doing great in the early 2000s, where it was, concerned with the home console market. The handheld market, though, totally different story, because they had all but had a monopoly on it for a long time, and that kind of begins way back in like the 1960s, when Hiroshi Yamauchi, who, like we just said, had stepped down, hired Gunpei Yokoi to work for the company. So Yokoi was the head of the Research and Development 1 division at Nintendo. Like I said, he'd been there since the 1960s. He was hired in the 60s, and personally hired at that by Yamauchi. And he became responsible.
Headhunted.
Oh yeah, like he found Gunpei Yokoi working at a factory and hired him on the spot. And he became responsible for a lot of the company's most popular products while they were still a toy manufacturer. So in 1974, Yokoi-san started kind of bringing his innovative, economical, toyetic thinking to the realm of electronic entertainment when the company pivoted entirely towards the development of early video and arcade games. And so, alongside Genya Takeda, he became one of the company's first 2 ever dedicated game designers. So, Yokoi and Takeda, they were the OG Nintendo game designers. And hardware designers, too. And so, in 1980, Nintendo released the first Game & Watch toys. Yokoi-san developed and created the Game & Watch after he was inspired watching like a salaryman playing around with a calculator out of boredom while riding the train to work.
Yeah.
And the Game & Watch games were hugely successful. They lasted until 1991, a whole freaking decade of Game & Watch. Mm-hmm. And the coolest thing about the Game & Watch is that each new iteration of it introduced radical new design elements and ideas to the console itself. And that started out with a plus-sign shaped control pad, which was the first control pad on any Nintendo games unit or console. Everything else had been joysticks or dials or buttons prior to that. So it was a plus-sign shaped control pad, the D-pad. And that later, of course, became incorporated into the design of the Famicom controller, which became the NES controller here. But that is a super iconic like piece of gaming tech right there, like a huge development, and that happened in
the brick.
Yeah, that happened in Nintendo's Game & Watch era.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course there was the plus-sign shaped control pad, but then you would see Game & Watches with mirrored screens, with wide screens, eventually even color screens. And interestingly, during the same year that the first ever clamshell folding laptop was released, a clamshell folding Game & Watch with dual LCD screens came onto the market. So I bet you can imagine how that becomes relevant later. So, yeah, in 89...
a prophecy.
Oh, yeah. So in 89, Yokoi began developing a successor to the Game & Watch, which he called the Game Boy. And the Game Boy is what most people consider like the kickstarting point for the modern handheld gaming market, and Nintendo's subsequent domination of it. And they faced early competition, so companies like Atari had the Lynx, Sega had the Game Gear, etc. The Game Boy's like economical design, which featured like these pea green monochromatic graphics, no backlighting, running on battery power, meant that it could be sold at a lower price, and because it had such good battery life, it lasted a really long time, making it like kind of like why would you pick the expensive color one that lasts like 2 hours on batteries, and just kind of why would you choose the one that dies when you can choose the one that lasts for hours?
Yeah.
It's it doesn't need a backlight to be a good console. That's, like I said, he was a very economical thinker. And it sold very well. Its expansive library of games basically assured its success throughout the early 90s. Like, it started out with a bunch of Research and Development 1 developed games, and branched out. Third parties like Square put a lot of console games on it, like they would adapt Final Fantasy into smaller Game Boy stuff, and Nintendo would eventually adapt some of their bigger console games like The Legend of Zelda and Super Mario to the thing, along with like arcade games and of course Tetris, which it shipped with in the US. And it was, extremely successful, and of course it, got like a huge resurgence later on in 95 when Pokemon Red and Blue came out, and that was just like, well, there we go. This is now the linchpin of the handheld gaming market for sure.
Yeah.
And Yokoi eventually left Nintendo after the launch and subsequent failure of the Virtual Boy, which he had been responsible for. So he envisioned it and he developed it, and it was a really odd, ambitious piece of hardware. Everybody's seen it. It looks like, a pair of eyes on legs or a pair of goggles on legs. It doesn't have a great library, and it gives you a headache
100% of the time.
It gives you a headache, and it has
I don't know if you've ever had the
graphics.
misfortune of actually trying one.
No.
I did. It's horrible. It's the worst.
The worst part about the Virtual Boy is that if it didn't have that shitty virtual reality goggle gimmick,
some of the games would be amazing.
It would be a really great console.
Isn't there a
the
Star
hardware
Fox?
is powerful. Yeah, Red Alarm.
Yeah,
a black and white, fully like Star Fox type game.
Yeah,
but yeah, it was. I think fair to say, way too ahead of its time. For
very
its own
ambitious.
Good.
Very like you can respect the hustle that they were trying to go for, but did not spend enough time in the oven on that one.
Yeah,
at all.
The Virtual Boy came out in 95 and floundered within a year and was discontinued in 96. Which
take that, Dreamcast.
That made Yokoi obviously look like a huge failure, and so he left Nintendo shamed, which is really a sad thing to do. And he developed one more handheld gaming console for Bandai. It's called the Wonder Swan, which, if you've ever looked at it, it's an interesting kind of Game Boy type system. It's interesting. It's not anywhere as good as the Game Boy, but it has its fan base, and it's got an interesting design in that you can play it vertically and horizontally, which is a very unique Yokoi-esque idea, right? And it's very economical. It's black and white. It runs on batteries, that kind of thing. It reminds me very much of the original Game Boy. So he came back with the Wonder Swan. The Wonder Swan was pretty successful, but only within Japan. And then unfortunately, he died in 1997, a year later, in a traffic accident at 56 years old.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
So that sucks, man. That really fucking sucks. He died at 56, kind of estranged from the company that he had kind of helped bring into, the forefront of gaming. And in a horrible accident.
Yeah.
Which really sucks. And meanwhile, as the Virtual Boy was floundering, the Game Boy, like I said, was kind of experiencing a resurgence in popularity because Pokemon Red and Blue came out in 95, and these games were, like the Game Boy, very economical, made a lot of technical concessions, but they struck a chord with Japan, and they became hugely successful, and
And then they struck a chord in the West.
Exactly, and then they hit huge in the West, as everybody knows. So by the end of the
we
decade,
didn't get Tiger Big Titty Pikachu, though.
Well, exactly, but this, I guess the resurgence of popularity of the Game Boy necessitated a bunch of new iterations of the original Game Boy. So by the end of the 90s, it had been iterated upon 4 times. So the first iteration is the much cheaper and slimmer Game Boy Pocket, which came out in 96, and that had like actual black and white graphics, not like monochromatic green, but proper black and white. And then in 1996, the Game Boy Light, which featured not 96, but 98, the Game Boy Light, which came out, and that had like a backlit screen. And that only came out in Japan. But the Game Boy Color, which had no backlit screen, but a bunch of exclusive games, it's almost a new console. Not quite, but pretty close to being a new console. It's basically the DSi to the DS. Launched, and that was pretty successful. And, lasted basically through to the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s. And SNK and Bandai kind of attempted to counter the Game Boy Color with the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the WonderSwan Color, but it was kind of too late, and the Game Boy had pretty much reached its apex of popularity. And then Nintendo decided, okay, let's put out like a properly new second Game Boy, and out comes the Game Boy Advance, which is a 32-bit console. It runs like a Super Nintendo in your pocket. That came out in 2001, so just like a few months before the launch of the GameCube, which kind of brings us back around full circle to where we start, right? So we are. Nintendo has been experiencing financial woes. This is the history of their handheld console. It's kind of kept them afloat. It's like the one place in the console market that they've been dominating. So now that we come back there, prior to like all of this talk of their downfall and difficulty with finances, they had actually begun developing another handheld console. So this had started. The DS had started its development before Nintendo started seeing its kind of product lines fail. And initially it was kind of envisioned as like a third pillar for the company. So kind of an attempt to develop something new, something experimental, like the Virtual Boy, but a lot more conservative, and a little closer to a Game Boy than not. Initially, it wasn't necessarily intended to replace either the Game Boy Advance or the GameCube, but after reporting their profit losses to the press, they confirmed that the development of the handheld was happening to the public, and they reasserted that their commitment was not to kind of the, media savvy, adult centric hardware with online capability and multimedia stuff that many game journalists were telling them or like asking them to maybe try and pursue, but to an all ages accessible gaming experience. So their commitment was squarely to what they were doing from the start. They just needed to find a way to do it that reached people. That was reaching people in a way that the GameCube wasn't. So, as the market shifted towards more complex hardware, a lot of people expected Nintendo to develop like a direct successor to their current gen systems that catered to those expectations. But it really is like couldn't be further from the truth what they ended up doing, right?
Yeah.
So soon after, in 2004, just a few weeks shy of E3, they fully revealed their new handheld console, which was the Nintendo DS, short for dual screen. The DS featured a folding clamshell design like the Game & Watch, and the Game Boy Advance SP, which had just come out recently as well. Dual displays with a touchscreen at the bottom, Wi-Fi capability for online gaming, a microphone, wireless download multiplayer functionality, and backwards compatibility with the Game Boy Advance.
Which was an important part for early life DS shit.
Oh yeah, they were saying it wasn't intended to replace the Game Boy, but you can tell that's it. Just by it having Game Boy Advance backwards compatibility,
they wanted the upgrade, and honestly, it was a big ass selling point.
It's super
for
duper
me
was.
Personally, because playing Metroid Fusion on the DS was way better than playing it on the SP. That being said, the SP was a great little handheld device. I feel like it was a very good step forward. But the DS having the backwards compatibility, and when they took it out, was kind of a bitter thing for me personally. I mean, probably for a lot of people. I think when they took it out of later iterations of the
It was
DS.
the DSi was the first one to not
Yeah,
feature it.
and then they just kind of stopped doing it, and it was like, but these games still exist. I would like to continue playing these games.
Exactly. But at that point, I guess they would expect you to have had a console capable of playing, that plus to get a DSi, which is like a weird ask, I think. But anyway, the DS was capable of displaying polygonal 3D graphics, which was super taken advantage of by its early lineup, which featured, like, amongst other things, a fully portable remake of Mario 64. Like, in all the ways that the Game Boy Advance was a portable SNES, the DS is like a portable Nintendo 64. Like, it could render high-quality pixel graphics, and it could, fully support 3D game remakes and stuff like that. The pack-in demo for the DS was like a new Metroid Prime game, like a 3D Metroid game, just to kind of show you what it would be. And then later on, that game would be released as Metroid Prime Hunters 2 years later in 2006.
Yeah.
And this demo actually complemented the DS's built-in PictoChat feature,
Yes.
which, if you know about that, was kind of like a really cool instant messaging and communication utility that allowed up to 16 people to chat via drawings and texting.
It was
using the
MSN for
wireless
Nintendo
system-to-system
kids.
LAN connection. Yeah, it was. It was. And like I said, it was using a wireless system-to-system LAN connection on a handheld console. That's nuts. That's a crazy cool piece of hardware.
Well, I mean, that, like, Nintendo was always kind of ahead of the curve for shit like that, because even the early versions of the Super Famicom had online DLC shit, right? Mm-hmm. Like, only in Japan, obviously. I don't think we ever got any of that. But in Japan, they had...
the Satellaview.
Yeah,
which allowed you to download games from satellite
and
connection.
Player-built levels and, like, entire games. And, like, it was very, very ahead of its time. Nintendo's always kind of been on the forefront of shit like that, and it's kind of ironic that moving forward they are really bad at internet now.
I know, it is interesting because they were kind of the first, like, people, at least within the handheld market, to really hop on that.
Yeah, and, like, do it pretty well, like, relatively well for how early it was.
But
I feel like they haven't moved forward
speaks for itself.
Since,
legacy
really.
Is important.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean,
it's just like now with friend
talks
code
about
shit.
playing PSP online. Ever.
No.
Ever.
I mean, wasn't it the Vita that had PSO too?
Exactly.
Yeah, but the Vita was later, I guess.
So there we go. So the DS was eventually released fully in North America on the 21st of November in 2004. So this was just 2 weeks prior to it coming out in Japan, which is crazy. It's I think the first ever time Nintendo ever released a console in America first. And 7 games came out with the DS in North America, so that's a pretty good starting lineup. And it was complemented by, like, a really weird advertising campaign that featured a slogan that I could only describe as kind of creepy. The slogan is "Touching is good."
Yeah. Well,
I think
my body is ready.
And Japan and Europe got a lot more games kind of out of the gate than we did in North America. So they got like
really did.
12 games and 16 games in Europe, respectively. And the PAL regions actually got 8, so more than us. But we got it first. And as I previously mentioned, a lot of these early games employed 3D graphics. So Super Mario 64 DS, Rayman DS, which is a remake of Rayman 2, which is another kind of 64 era platformer, 3D platformer.
Did we get? Oops, sorry, I keep hitting my mic. Did we get Rayman DS?
I believe we did. Urban Asphalt GT, which is like a 3D racing game, kind of like a Need for Speed. And others were kind of touchscreen optimized ports or reimaginings of arcade games, so Mr. Driller Drill Spirits and Retro Atari Classics in Europe. It was a European exclusive. But the real standouts of this early lineup, at least in my opinion, are like the weirder, more experimental titles. So there was a minigame collection that Sega put out called Feel the Magic XYXX, which, if you've ever seen it, is this very strange game with, like, silhouetted people all in black with, like, kind of loud, colorful clothing on. And it's a game about, like, trying to woo a girl by doing a bunch of really esoteric, strange activities.
So just like real life?
Yeah, it's really strange. It's an interesting, cool.
Oh
little
my
game.
god, okay, yeah, this looks stylized as shit and
It's
cool.
weird. Nintendo had their own little mini game thing because they had a
that's
WarioWare on the DS called
yeah.
WarioWare Touched, which is a really
That's
good WarioWare.
Yeah.
And Japan also got a really cool Nintendo developed music sim called Daigasso Band Brothers, which was like a fully kind of like a music creation sim, like a music sim. It's really interesting, and it completely plays with the touchscreen. It allows you to strum the guitar chords and scratch and play the drums with the touchscreen and record music. So it was like the strange things like these with like their unique touchscreen interfaces, cool visuals. These things illustrated that developers could see that there was an immense amount of potential that the new system was offering. A lot more potential than something like maybe even the GameCube was to them. And over time, the DS would end up playing host to thousands of unique titles, with hundreds of publishers and series being represented on the console. And the following years would inevitably prove to be far kinder to Nintendo. So they kind of ended up pulling themselves out of their little software slump, and they did good. So Iwata kind of introduced this business strategy to Nintendo called Blue Ocean, which allowed them to kind of generate and nurture an entirely new corner of the market for themselves. So that new corner of the market became the cornerstone of Nintendo going forward, which was hardware and software that was so utilitarian that it could please both people who want to develop for hardcore gamers and people who want to develop games for casual, family-oriented forms of play, right?
Yeah.
And they got a lot of flack for it, as like kind of previously stated. People were like, "Why are you doing this? Blah blah blah. This is for babies." But this decision to pivot towards a more accessible and diverse opportunity and gaming kind of experiences kind of pulled the company out of its slump. And their first real taste of commercial success in years with a piece of hardware came through the DS. So combined, the DS family of consoles from the DS Lite, DSi, and the 3DS are reported to have sold close to 154.2 million units. That makes it the second best-selling console of all time, after the PS2.
Yeah.
The second best-selling console of all time.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And if you were a kid growing up in the early 2000s, chances are the ubiquity of the DS was not lost on you. You probably knew a lot of people who were excited about it, who had it, who loved playing it, and would play it together. And that's just kind of like an abridged history of the Nintendo DS. But yeah, like it's a legacy that starts as far back as in the 60s when Yokoi is hired to the company. And I feel like the DS is kind of like a proper conclusion to the story of Yokoi's legacy at Nintendo, because it, allows him to have a happier ending than leaving the company shamed for developing a console that unfortunately didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah.
But I guess following forward from that, I guess I just want to open up the floor for us to have a discussion about our personal histories with the DS, because we both grew up with it. It was a console that was prevalent in both of our childhoods, and
it was my main source of gaming for a good portion of my early not high school, but like pre-high school, because I was in the States at the time, so it was like pre-secondary.
You were in Tennessee, right?
Yeah, I was in Tennessee for most of that. And I have actually one of my favorite memories with the early DS was the Mario Hoops game.
Mario Hoops 3-on-3.
Yeah, because
that was developed
at my
by
school,
Square Enix.
It was the closest fucking thing I've ever seen happen in a school to like fighting games in arcades.
Wow.
Because it was straight up like it was the same thing. Like you would have the winner on their DS just cleaning house with a lineup of people waiting to either take the new champion chair or just get bodied and fucking go off. Like my school in Tennessee, it was everyone had that game, and like lunchtime, recess, all that shit, we were always just fucking popping off. and like doing the best fucking that we could. Obviously, like it's different than a fighting game, but it was like the closest to that like FGC arcade culture.
Oh yeah,
that wasn't in an arcade that I've seen since like that I've seen outside of the actual FGC.
That's really interesting,
right?
That's totally not. Totally outside of my experience with the DS. It's not what it's that game. I don't think I knew anybody who had it.
Really? Because in this, my school, I don't know what it was. Everyone fucking had it, and it was like, for a full year, it was the shit.
I think that comes down to the popularity of basketball in the United States versus
especially in like the south.
Oh yeah, for
of
sure.
the United States, right? Like it was Tennessee. Basketball was number one, football was second, and that was pretty much it. Like soccer, everyone just kind of made fun of. But yeah, no, like I think that was it. Like basketball was just such an integrated thing there, and like having a game that was super easily accessible and like fun competitively.
Yeah.
Like there was some bullshit in that game.
Characters.
Yeah, there was some bullshit in that game. Oh my god.
That's really interesting. It's the first time I've actually ever heard of anybody talking extensively about that game, which is why I guess I kind of started this podcast, because I was thinking one day, why is it that there's so many games on the DS that I remember fondly that other people haven't heard of? And it got me thinking about making this. But yeah, kind of like you, the DS was like a huge part of my like gaming experience as a kid. Like I got a Game Boy Advance SP for my first games console that I owned properly. But
yeah,
I had like a few games for that. I had like Mario, some of the Mario Advance remakes, and I had
Link to the Past,
a couple of tie-in games. I didn't have Link to the Past, but I played it.
Oh, really?
I love that game.
Link to the Past was the because the SP was a gift on one of my birthdays. But my parents were like, "Oh, here's a game," and it was a Game Boy Advance game, but I didn't have a Game Boy Advance at the time, and I was like, "Is that other box a Game Boy Advance?" And they're like, "You're no fun." And I was like, "What? I'm not stupid."
That's great.
I know you guys aren't stupid. You guys are the ones who keep like buying me all my video games. Like if I was going out and being like, "Get me like this, and I want this," and they'll be like, "You want the Nintendo Final Fantasy?" Like, yeah, sure, whatever. You don't know what you're talking about, but like, they were both like super into video games. I was like, "Why you wouldn't get me this unless you got me the other thing?"
That's really
Come on.
funny.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So I had a Game Boy Advance SP. I played it a lot. It was like my first console that I ever owned. And then, as I got my SP, the DS was announced and coming out, and I was I had a subscription to Nintendo Power for a really long time. I want to say for nearly 10 years I had a subscription to Nintendo Power, and throughout that 10 years was basically the whole time that the DS was like the second most dominant Nintendo console after the Wii. So I didn't really get a DS when it first came out. I had a lot of friends who owned it, who played it. And I saw them playing games like Brain Age. I saw them playing, Mario 64, DS, stuff like that. And I thought it was really cool. And I knew a lot about it because I had been reading about it since it was announced in Nintendo Power. But I didn't own one until the DS Lite came out. I got the Onyx Black DS Lite. And that was, I think, really where my like love affair with gaming kind of started. Because that became my primary games console for... I don't know. Until I got the 3DS, which was in high school. So all throughout like the latter half of elementary, all the way into high school, into like the middle of high school, then I got a 3DS maybe in 10th grade, So for a long time, so the DS family of consoles really, I think, lasted me like 15 years total, from like age 10 all the way to maybe even 19 or 20 years old, which is pretty crazy to think. Even close to 25, because I pretty much.
Yeah.
But it was a big part of my childhood, and yeah, I have probably more 3DS and DS games combined, like games for DS consoles, than I do for any other console. I have close to 100 if I combine my DS and 3DS collections together. The majority of them, I'm sure, as many people would be surprised to hear, are RPGs. But
What?
I played a lot of single player RPGs on handheld consoles. That was the
That's
bread and
nuts.
butter of my gaming experience for NES.
I could have never guessed.
You could have never guessed, right? I'm just, it's so not on brand for me. And of course, I have a lot of other games too. I've got.
You're much more of a first-person shooter, like the COD 3DS.
Oh, you
game.
know,
I thought that was your
all
shit.
over those DS COD ports.
Yeah.
You know it.
Yeah.
I can't believe those exist.
Me neither. Shit was wild.
But it just goes to show you. The
Did
kind of
anyone
games they were
ever
putting
own those?
on the DS? I know people who played them and owned them.
Okay.
I know people who even kind of stand by a few of them. The cool thing about the DS is the DS was, like, just kind of, I guess I described it earlier, but like full of just a huge variety of games were possible on it because of the hardware. So you were getting interesting fucking games on there. Like, of course, you were getting stuff like Dementium, Dementium the Ward, and Moon, another cool game. Both of which are like full-on first-person survival horror games / shooters, which is pretty impressive on a handheld console. And they're good. They're better than pretty much any first-person shooter on the PSP. That's for sure, because those are all shit. And much better than any of those COD ports. That's for sure. But those, they have a perfect interface for a first-person gameplay because you control the camera with the stylus, you move with the control pad, and you shoot with a trigger button. It's perfect.
Perfect's a little extreme. It's a little extreme. I played the Metroid Prime thing.
Which one,
demo.
Hunters or the demo?
No, the demo. It wasn't that great.
First Hunt is not good. Hunters is better.
I'll believe you. I haven't tried.
Hunters is an improvement.
I feel like if we're gonna talk about weird shit to come to the DS, this is a little late in the DS life. It's more 3DS shit, but I mean, I guess it still counts, right?
Mm-hmm, of course.
But Street Fighter 4 being on the DS,
I have that,
is still a fucking weird ass thing to me.
And the craziest thing is, it's a great port.
It's a really good port.
It is undoubtedly compromised.
I mean,
because
before my
it
has to be,
but it is very, very good. Like,
and even that being said,
I think Street Fighter V, when it was first released, was less of a good value overall than the 3DS port of 4.
Yeah. I think I would even maybe if you're including the online, Street Fighter V is not. It's not that great comparatively.
No. Now
anyway.
It's a much better game, obviously. But as it stands, like when Street Fighter V came out,
Vanilla Street Fighter V was a mess.
It had fucking nothing.
It had nothing. The gameplay remains a little bland.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's my main... Like, I love Street Fighter, and I wanted Street Fighter V to be a really good game. I played a lot of Street Fighter V. I think I have... I don't even know how many hours on Steam. I'm kind of afraid to check right now. I played mostly G, obviously, because it's just Q from Third Strike, and Q was my boy.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to shit on Street Fighter V during the DS thing, but anyway, the Street Fighter 4 port of the DS port of the Street Fighter 4 was very good, and even the Virtual Console versions of the Street Fighter games, like Street Fighter Alpha.
Yeah.
I was playing Alpha 2, I think, right before my DS snapped in half in my bag.
Oops.
And now I'm just kind of looking for a used one in a pawn shop once pawn shops feel a little safer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably just going to pick one up and be like, I'll just transfer my data for 4 hours or whatever.
It's not a huge it's not a huge data transfer if you're transferring from a more recent DS.
Yeah, no, it's way less bad than it used to be.
Shouldn't be a big deal. But like that, the DS family of consoles host like a variety of different kinds of games. So, like I said, from survival horror to full-on online fighting games that you can play. A huge early hit for it was Mario Kart DS, which I think that's a game that would be the closest equivalent that I had in my experience growing up with the DS to what you had with Mario Hoops.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was also another really big one, but it wasn't a lineup, right? Because you could have, 8 people at once? So that was more of a this cluster, while waiting in line, will play Mario Kart.
Oh, yeah.
While everyone else is waiting to get fucking bodied in Mario Hoops and just crowding around. Like, it was... The energy around that fucking game at my school was unrivaled to like a. I think the closest thing I could come to is probably like any fighting game in an arcade, like KI or fucking Third Strike fight, like just people crowding around and being like, oh, and you're like, the screens are so small, how do you even see what's going on? But it was like the hype was so there. It was sick.
I remember.
Take me back.
I remember very specifically, like in like my personal experience, the big game was Mario Kart DS, and I remember like, you know, like when you have like a pedagogical day, but your school has an after school program, so you go to that because your parents work. So I went to like the daycare after school kind of thing at my school because my parents worked until pretty late and couldn't pick me up from school immediately, and I couldn't take the bus home. So I would stay there, and people would play their DS after school and stuff. But during like the pedagogical days, where you'd go in and you'd stay there for like, you know, for most of the day, from like 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon at school, just doing free time shit, doing whatever you wanted. Everybody would whip out their DS, and they would just be playing Mario Kart like nobody's freaking business. It was Mario Kart, Mario Kart, Mario Kart all the time. People were playing download play, because the cool thing about DS download play was that even if you didn't have the game, certain games, because they were LAN, allowed you to play together regardless of whether or not you had it.
That was the sickest shit.
Really cool.
Like,
so you wouldn't get to choose your character or cart, but you would get to play, and that's great. So people would be doing that. People who didn't even have the game would be enjoying themselves with it. And people would also play a variety of other games together. Later on, people would be playing Pokemon together when Diamond and Pearl came out, using the wireless connection. They would battle against each other and trade. It was really like school and the DS are like perfectly made for each other, because it's a place where a bunch of different kids with the means to own a DS could interact and play with one another on this console together. And it was a really good social experience. But yeah, the DS was just kind of like it was a huge deal for us, I think, especially for kids our age. You know, because people now who are like 25, 26, 24 years old, whatever, you grew up during the prime time of the DS, and the DS was targeted towards you. You were its target audience when it came to like who they were trying to get, because it was people your age, regardless of whether or not they played games. If you didn't want to play Mario Kart, if you didn't want to play Mario 64 DS or Rayman or whatever, guess what? You could play Nintendogs, because the Nintendogs was freaking huge. And
oh my fuck,
Nintendogs and games
I forgot
games
about
like Brain
Nintendogs.
Age. I know a lot of kids who weren't into gaming, but they sure loved Brain Age.
I never touched Brain Age. Nintendogs, I must have at least like 1,200 hours in that shit.
Nintendogs got my sister into playing video games.
Yeah.
My sister, who does not play video
fucking,
games, is
what
not
is
really
it?
even that interested in them. But that got my sister playing them.
Rune. Kind of a Harvest Moon like.
Rune Factory.
Yes, thank God.
Yeah,
Fuck,
it is.
Jesus Christ.
It is literally a Harvest Moon spin-off.
Yes.
Yeah, Rune Factory.
Rune Factory
huge.
was amazing.
That's kind of an interesting game because it combines. We'll have to do an episode on that specifically, because those are
Of
very
course.
cool.
And especially since the new one's coming out, or is out?
Yeah.
Is it out yet?
It's,
I don't think it is.
The new one, Story of Seasons Mineral Town, just came out.
Yeah.
It's a full-on remake of the Friends of Mineral Town games. Harvest Moon and the Story of Seasons shit, by the way, people listening, if you don't know what that's all about,
God,
it
Jesus
is freaking
fuck.
crazy. But
we'll do a whole we'll do a bonus round on that.
We could even do a bonus round on that, because I actually
Yeah.
have a lot of experience with Harvest Moon. I love those games. But yeah, Rune Factory, which was a Harvest Moon like on DS, very, very good. There were kind of sequel, like they also would sequelize a lot of games that were on the Game Boy, would get direct sequels on the DS. So the Phoenix Wright games, which came out on the Game Boy in Japan, the first couple, ended up becoming full-on DS games when they were released in the West. You would also get games like Mega Man ZX, which were developed by Inti Creates, and I've spoken about them before, but they're direct sequels to the Zero games on the GBA. And you also had stuff like New Super Mario Bros., which is kind of like an entirely new, and it's a thing that started on the DS, which is kind of a big thing, because those games are pretty much still coming out now. They
Yeah.
just ported New Super Mario Brothers U to the Switch not too long
The
ago.
only thing that the newer versions don't have is the fun-ass party mini-games.
That's true, but you know what they do have?
Good gameplay?
Good gameplay. Because if you go back to New Super Mario Brothers,
I know,
that
it's
game
rough.
plays like fucking shit. Holy
Dude,
crap.
I made it to the end, like, levels, like the tail end of Bowser Castle. That shit is, like, basically impossible. I remember raging as a child.
And the 2.5D graphics are ugly as sin.
Oh yeah, if
They
you
look
go back,
so
it's horrible.
bad. They look
Like I
so
remember
fucking bad.
being like, "Wow, this looks so great" when they first came out, but then going back to them now and being like, "Wow, that's a lot of pixels."
Oh, another notable 3D remake, or like full-on 3D reimagining of older 2D games that came out on the DS were Final Fantasies 3 and 4. They both got remade on the DS, and both of them came to the West, and I owned both of them. Final Fantasy 3 on the DS was the first Final Fantasy game that I ever owned. Not the first one I ever played, because the first game I had played was 4, which I borrowed from my friend on the Game Boy. But 3 was the first one I ever owned, and boy, oh boy, was I obsessed with that game. I had like a Prima guide to it that I read like it was the Bible. I
Fair
was
enough.
freaking obsessed with Final Fantasy 3. It's still one of my favorite versions of that. It's my favorite version of that game for sure. But still one of my favorite Final Fantasies, just out of pure nostalgia, if anything. Not my favorite, because 4 really does take the cake for me. Like, that is my Final Fantasy game. But very good game, and it's stayed very high in my esteem since I played it. And, like, of course, like I mentioned before, Pokemon came to the DS, and like a lot of Pokemon games, actually, the interesting thing about Pokemon on the DS too, I should say, is that it kind of became like a huge kind of point of evolution for the series. Because, no, I mean, not only did it introduce wireless trade, but wireless trade online,
Yeah,
which was massive with the global
Wonder
the global
Trade.
trade station, and eventually that would become stuff like Wonder Trade, which is still in Pokemon now.
which
and
is
of
one
course-
of the best things to happen since.
Massive multiplayer online battles across the world with different players from other countries. That's so fun, and it's something that I sadly never got to experience, but what a novel idea. And of course, there were a bunch of Pokemon games that came out on the DS. Of course, you have Diamond and Pearl, which were the first two. Then the third version of Diamond and Pearl came out. That's Platinum. But then following Diamond and Pearl, and Platinum, which I guess, like, I don't know what their esteem is in the fan base currently. It is my personal belief that they're kind of some of the worst games in the series. If only because they're
I
They're
don't
very-
think I ever even touched them.
they're rough to go back to. They play very slowly, and while Platinum is a much faster game, I feel like this is something that I'm sure has been said about Pokemon before, but they always have like a rough transitional period when they move from console to console. But like after like the first Pokemon game comes out on a new console, the immediate preceding version is such an improvement on like a huge board, and that's kind of what happened with Diamond and Pearl, where Diamond and Pearl are very slow, they're kind of perfunctory, they go on for a very long time, but they display like a lot of positive qualities too that get carried over to Platinum, and Platinum is a much quicker game. It has a bunch of new Pokemon, the story is a lot more refined, and it introduces the idea of like fully kind of 3D rendered environments, which then gets iterated upon in the next games, which are the Johto remakes, which basically are like Fire Red and Leaf Green, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, completely remade versions of Gold and Silver from the Game Boy. And those games are incredible Pokemon games. And those games are great. They introduce like a lot of the elements that were really cool about Platinum, and like expand upon them, like letting you have a Pokemon that follows you around, kind of like in Pokemon Yellow. But it's the first Pokemon in your party that follows you around. And then Pokemon Black and White, and Black and White 2. Those games are, in my opinion, the apex of the Pokemon series. They are some of the best games in the series. They are the best versions of the game as it stands, as like within its
The
traditional
pacing
format.
The pacing, I would say, is probably on the top tier.
Oh yeah, they're
I was in the
beautifully paced
middle.
games.
I was in the middle of playing Black or White. I don't remember. I was in the middle of playing one of the versions when my DS also snapped. Like I was playing that and Street Fighter Alpha 2 kind of simultaneously. And so I was about, I think I was like 3 badges in.
Okay.
So I was still pretty early, but I was like, oh no, the pacing's really good. The sprites are fucking amazing. Like the music's next level shit.
Oh, yeah.
Like especially like one of the like highest points I can give the music in black and white is that like finding the little instrument wielding people in the
and
town,
allowing them to add a secondary
Yes.
harmony or melody to the song.
and like it fades in and out as you get closer to them depending. It's just
So beautiful. My favorite thing that they do in that game is when you go to this area called the Village Bridge, there are 4 musicians around the Village Bridge that, depending on which version of the game, are different kinds of musicians. But the Village Bridge melody is a very kind of simple, lilting, pretty kind of thing. And as you go to these different guys, they add a new layer and a new layer and a new layer to the song until it becomes this beautiful, beautiful tune. And
it's amazing how seamless.
With a vocal bit, there's a beatboxer in one
Oh,
version,
really?
and an enka singer in the other. So, like, it changes the whole like sonic palette of that game.
Yeah,
and
it's
there's just
really,
some really great town themes in that too, like the town theme for Driftvale.
Yeah,
City.
even without the instrumental like fade-ins and like shit, like the music was good. It's just that adds a extra layer of like, it just adds an extra layer of instruments, and you're like,
and
God,
of course there's fully 3D rendered environments in that game, or with like the illusion of 3D at the very least. And
I remember the
very,
city,
very impressive like vistas in the game that as you travel across them dynamically shift in camera angle to show you different perspectives on these beautiful
like
locales.
kind of like Silent Hill camera angles, where it's kind of a fixed camera angle, but then it kind of twists and warps itself to show you the environment a little better. It's really nice. Obviously not same mood as Silent Hill, but like kind of the same techniques in some areas, if I recall correctly.
Oh yeah, we can do like a whole episode on those games eventually. But
definitely.
That's just like a small sample of like what these developers were doing on the console, and of course you would get really experimental stuff later on down the line too. I mean, early on you had games like Electroplankton, which is a very strange esoteric game that was, I believe, developed in-house at Nintendo and is like a strange thing that feels like a tech demo, and it's all about music and it's odd, but it's kind of cool and like a weird relic of the time. And then you had stuff like Nintendogs, like I said, Brain Age, all of these games that were labeled under this kind of imprint of games that Nintendo introduced called Touch Generations, which of course we're taking our title from. And Touch Generations were completely casual focused. And that was really a great move for them because, like we said, it ended up pulling them out of their little slump that they were in financially and making them far more accessible to everybody. And that trend would eventually continue onto the Wii, which is a console that was fully accessible to all kinds of different people with different accessibility needs, different interest levels, different levels of involvement necessary, you know?
Yeah.
It started a very positive trend within the company to looking towards really truly accessible gaming experiences. And I think that just because of that, the DS is a really strong console. And like I stated at the beginning of the episode, I want to make it our mission statement to explore all the games,
weird,
all the interesting, weird, or, you know, even if not interesting or weird, noteworthy games worth discussing. I mean, there's tons of stuff we can get into, but the DS really represents an interesting crossroads in the history of gaming as like a hobby, in the history of gaming as an art form, in the history of gaming as technology. It's like the perfect area to examine all those things at a cross section. So I guess like that's kind of where we want to leave you off for today. But
seems like a good cutoff point.
I think that if you have any love for the DS at all, or even if you're just interested in a really unique piece of gaming history, join us on Touch Generation, and we'll go through it with you. We'll explore all these cool things that all these games did that really made an impression on us and made the DS a really historically important console, and of course the second best selling series of consoles of all time. But thank you very much for joining us on our inaugural episode.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, we really do. And we hope to see you soon with a brand new episode focusing on some super cool games for the Nintendo DS. Thank you very much.